Hey everyone, it's Rachel. As you know, we are currently on our season break. We are so excited to be coming back very soon with a bunch of new episodes for season 10. But in the meantime, we thought it might be fun to drop a bonus episode. Hope you all enjoy. Hello, and welcome to another Hasty History episode. Bonus episodes that we are calling No Nonsense, Crash Course, Cram Session History Lessons. So there will be no cocktail segment, no ads, and no bloopers. This is just a quick download of some heavy history content. If you enjoy longer podcast episodes with lots of back and forth conversation over unique cocktails, we recommend checking out our regular #history episodes, which drop weekly on our regular feed. But as for now, let's get to this week's topic. Today, we will be discussing a woman that embodies feminism and strength, fighting back against sexism and destroying the patriarchy. So what did this woman do to achieve all of that? Well, she, smoked a cigarette. No, but seriously. In January of 1908, a woman named Katie Mulcahey was arrested when she was caught smoking in public. Just one day prior, a new ordinance was passed that banned women, and only women, from smoking in public places. Mulcahey, not knowing about the new ordinance, struck a match and lit her cigarette in public. She was cited for the infraction because police officers at this time had nothing better to do? Question mark? But refused to pay and was immediately arrested. When put before a judge, she was quoted as saying, quote, "I've got as much right to smoke as you have. I never heard of this new law, and I don't want to hear about it. No man shall dictate to me," unquote. If you are just as fascinated by this story as I am, stick around and let's dive in. Think back to the images that we see from the early 1900s. Is not everyone smoking a cigarette in these pictures? Cigarettes were wildly popular in the United States in the early and mid-1900s. In fact, in 1901 alone, some 3.5 million cigarettes were sold here in the United States. Much of the popularity of cigarettes in the early 1900s can be credited to the rolling machine. The rolling machine, which was patented in 1880, really changed the game. Prior to 1880, cigarettes were rolled by hand, which meant that only about 4 or 5 cigarettes could be made per minute. As you can imagine, 4 or 5 cigarettes per minute was not enough to lead to mass production or popularity of the product. With the invention of the rolling machine, however, some 210 cigarettes could be made in 1 minute. We're talking tens of thousands of cigarettes rolled per day. And just for reference, nowadays, cigarette rolling machines can roll more than 20,000 cigarettes per minute. We could do an entire episode on historic cigarette marketing, but you all have seen those images before. The ones that market cigarettes as healthy and safe. The ones that say doctors and dentists and scientists endorse them. The ones with celebrity endorsements. And the ones specifically targeted at minors. Cigarette companies would put coupons or collectible cards in their cigarette packets to encourage people to buy them. Over the course of the next few decades, cigarette consumption would increase by nearly 8,000%. It wouldn't be until the 1960s that the U.S. Surgeon General would release reports about the damaging health effects of smoking, and only then did America begin to see a decrease in cigarette sales. With the mass production, the mass marketing, and the lack of health data behind them, cigarettes were wildly popular throughout the United States in the early and mid-1900s. They were particularly popular with American women. Remember, we're talking early 1900s here, before women had the right to vote. Smoking a cigarette was seen as a sign of masculinity, for women a sign of equality. In fact, much of the marketing targeted at women by cigarette companies depicted cigarettes as synonymous with liberation for women. The early 1900s were a really pivotal moment in women's history. They were campaigning for the right to vote, fighting social norms by wearing trousers instead of dresses, making their way into the workforce, and so much more. But wait, not too fast, ladies. This was way too much all at once. One thing society simply could not accept was women smoking in public. No, that would be too much equality, you see. Because although we are talking about a time period in history where a lot of things were moving and shaking, some things were still very, very old school. We're talking about a time period in American history where women weren't even allowed to move about without an escort. As historian Emily Remus writes, without a male escort, women were refused service in most restaurants, cafes, and hotels. In this context here, a woman smoking a cigarette was considered to be immoral, sexual even. At least that's how New York City felt. In fact, it was fairly common in the city for a woman smoking in a public place, say a bar or a restaurant, to be asked by the owner to knock it off. That's why it was a big freaking deal when Café Martin, a restaurant within the city, announced on New Year's Eve of 1907 that they were going to allow women to smoke inside their establishment that day. Gasp! This progressive suggestion didn't last for long, though. Timothy Little Tim Sullivan, an elected member, was successful in getting the Sullivan Ordinance passed unanimously, which stated that women were not allowed to smoke within public places. Sullivan, the brilliant man that he was, admitted that he had never actually seen a woman smoking in public before, but as Karen Harris writes for historydaily.org, Sullivan was, quote, sure he would lose all respect for a lady if he did see it, unquote. Now, I think it's important to note the distinction of smoking in public places versus just smoking in public, because although the Sullivan Ordinance did not technically bar women from smoking in public, say on the sidewalk, it was generally read that way and therefore enforced as such. And that would be affirmed the very next day after the ordinance had passed. Katie Mulcahey lit a cigarette as she stood on the sidewalk in New York City. A cop stopped her immediately, saying, "Madame, you mustn't." When she didn't put out her cigarette, she was fined $5, the equivalent today of roughly $150. When she refused to pay the fine for breaking a law she had never even heard of, she was arrested. Mulcahey stuck to her guns, and to reiterate the quote that I read at the top of the episode, she told the judge, quote, "I've got as much right to smoke as you have. I never heard of this new law, and I don't want to hear about it. No man shall dictate to me," unquote. Although there were, of course, those that applauded this arrest, the majority of New York City was on Mulcahey's side. A woman being arrested for smoking in public? Absurd. After reading and rereading the Sullivan Ordinance over and over, those in support of Mulcahey found that nowhere in it were there mention of a fine or punishment for the crime of smoking in public as a woman. As a result, Mulcahey was released the very next day, and the infraction was not noted in her records. New York City Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. would veto the Sullivan Ordinance 2 weeks later, and Katie Mulcahey would go down in history as the only person to have ever broken the absurd law. Believe it or not, New York City would try again 3 years later to once again ban women from smoking in public. Fortunately, this time, lawmakers were told, "Girl, please," and the ordinance did not pass. Thank you all, as always, for listening to another episode of Hasty History. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we encourage you to check out some of our full-length episodes of #History, which we drop weekly. If you have suggestions for more Hasty History topics, please send them our way at #History1865@gmail.com or on our website at #History-pod.com. We want to tailor these Hasty History episodes to you, so be sure to drop us a line on any topic you love or want to learn more about. Make sure also to follow us on Instagram at #History_podcast, where we post lots of extra goods, including behind the scenes of recordings, drink recipes, and so much more. You can also check us out online at #History-pod.com for all sources used to put together this episode. Thank you all so much. Stay safe out there, and we will catch you next time.